Hey all, welcome to the Skeptic Hangout, the place where we sit back, relax, and discuss some of humanity's most controversial and intriguing concepts through the lens of skepticism. We have with us Richard Gilliver from Skeptic Takeout, Laura McGee from Unapologetically Me, and Richard Gill from the Yorkshire Atheist. Today, we are going to be discussing science. So, grab your English tea or your orange mocha frappuccino with extra whip, get comfy, and join us as we unpack methods to discover life, the universe, and everything. So, Richards, how are you guys doing today?
Yeah, good. Thank you. I've just had my.
Oh, we're talking over each other, Jill. You go.
You're starting off on the right foot.
I've literally just
at the same time.
I've had my second injection for the vaccine, so I'm fully vaccinated now, and hopefully not going to have any serious side effects from it. And see how we get on with that.
Yeah, I hope it goes well for you. I know it was a little bit rough for me for about a week.
Yeah, my wife's just had her second shot. Actually, I'm obviously in too young an age bracket to have been offered mine yet. So,
for those of you not watching the video, I'm. Okay, so today's topic is a cool one. Today's topic is science, and what I think is cool about that is it's really easy to have a conversation and be skeptical about things like ghosts or UFOs or religion, because those are kinds of things that are all sort of a bit controversial anyway. But science is kind of one of those things that it seems on its surface like everyone should just be kind of cool with it. But I have a lot of different ways in which I feel like I could skeptic the shit out of science. So I'm really excited about this one. But what do you guys think? Like when you think about science from a lens of skepticism, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
For me, I think a lot of what comes to mind, and I think it's possibly the sort of echo chamber that us three are in, is that there's always this conflict between religion and science, as if science has some like beef with religion when it doesn't usually even concern itself.
Like they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah, like it's either one or the other. But really, I mean, obviously I'm a teacher and stuff, so I teach science to my students, and it's just wonderful. Like the things that we can find out and explore and discover, that sort of gaining of knowledge across generations of time of humans, and the things we can achieve and do is unbelievable because of the scientific method and understanding things in a specific way.
So then what would you say like your sort of definition off the top of your head of science is?
Definition of the topic, because it's the process of discovering things, isn't it? So like about how people sort of start with a question or an idea, and then they like obviously research a topic area, come up with some hypothesis that they then test in a fair way. They can repeat that test, and then they can hopefully come up with some I can't speak, some sort of conclusion based on that. And I guess the good thing about it from a skeptic's point of view is the fact, and I think Gilliver, you've talked about this previously, is that all areas of science should be replicable. So the results should be replicable. So if you read about something that you think is too good to be true or far too outlandish sounding to seem viable, well, you should, if it was true, be able to undertake the same research or the same studies or the same investigations and come up with the same thing. So it's does that, I don't know if that answered your question. I think it did. That was my sort of off the top of my head.
No, I like that. That actually it answered my question and expanded on it, which I think is really great because I think that there's sort of a misunderstanding with people about what makes something science and what makes something not science, right? Or getting a little bit too wrapped up around science being like a beast or a thing or a well, I mean, it is a process, but it almost becomes like a monolith, like politics, economics, religion, science, right? So it is good to have that sort of like understanding of what we mean when we say science, you know?
Jillifer, what about you in terms of like the same question, I guess?
Right. Before I answer the question, I'm just going to tell you what I think of science in general.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because we say this on a weekly basis. I'm just old. Right. So you've got to bear that in mind when I tell you about this.
You know, old is the new young, right? Like, you're good. You're fine.
when I was young, when I was genuinely young, everything we have now was the future. And that might not make much sense to a lot of our listeners who are younger. But it was literally, if you watch some kind of futuristic sci-fi show and they've got stuff that you can't possibly imagine, that's what now was like for me then. Because we didn't have phones you could hold in your hand.
Yeah, the internet.
The internet. You know, you could.
It's like here I have access to the sum of human knowledge just on this tiny little piece of metal and glass in my pocket.
If you wanted information, you went to a library. If you wanted to watch TV, you sat down in the court with the TV in the corner of the room and put the box on. You couldn't watch it while you were walking around. If you wanted to make a phone call, unless you were really rich, you had to go and use the phone that was plugged into the wall. And that was it. All this stuff now we have. It's just the future.
Yeah,
and that's why I find science so amazing, because I've seen it in action over my lifetime.
So I remember being in math class, and I remember my teacher saying it's really important to learn math and to memorize your multiplication tables and to learn division and all that stuff, because when you grow up, you are not going to be walking around day to day with a calculator in your pocket. Well, I just want to say, thanks to science, I now walk around every day with a calculator in my pocket, right? So I agree with you. Like, we kind of take for granted that science is what propels us into the future from what we think of as being like woo-woo or out there or not possible. And then a decade or 2 decades from now, it's standard living.
Yeah. Regarding skepticism and science, I think the biggest thing that we should get across to people, which I don't think, and I agree with Richard, in our little echo chamber, we've got this kind of, there's a lot of this science versus religion thing that goes off. But outside of that, I don't think people in general realize that it's not just science. It's not just one thing. There are different scientific methods. It's not just one method. You don't just apply one method of something to find out things which form the body of scientific work. It's a very strict kind of procedure. Sometimes it's self-correcting. If there are papers released and they're wrong, it's up to the peer of experts in that community to look at that work and say, no, that's not right. And to get a scientific paper reviewed is a long process. It's not just a case of, I've got an idea, I've written this down, and then therefore it makes up science. It's a long and arduous process.
And it's brutal. Yeah.
Yeah, like, definitely.
The idea is that they're trying deliberately to tear your argument apart so that they can determine whether or not there's any sort of truth to it or any sort of veracity at all. But yeah, I want to, just for the audience and just for everybody's sake, I wanted to kind of go back on what you were just saying about the scientific process, how there is no one scientific process. That is hugely misunderstood in like just general conversation, like, oh, let's use the scientific process. So I wanted to kind of unpack that for a second and tell you what I think that means, right? Because so let's say you want to discover what kind of a chemical you have. And I remember being in chemistry and doing we had to do a qualitative analysis portion where we were given a mystery substance, right? And you add other chemicals to it and you perform these tests, or how does it react under this or under that? Is it flammable? And you start to eliminate what it isn't to discover what it is. And we were able to like guess what the mystery science, the chemical element was. You don't do that when you're doing a scientific process to discover, say, the movement of the moon around the Earth, right? You use a different process to discover the movement of planets or the movement of even like, say, when you want to discover something about an animal species, right? It's a different scientific process. So what you guys really mean by that, or what you, Jilliver, mean by that, is depending on what you're trying to discover, you have to come up with a different test or a different set of criteria depending on what it is, right?
And one one idea may require multiple tests. If you have a look at evolution, and I mean, I'm not an expert in this area whatsoever. I really don't know that much about it from a technical perspective.
Right.
But if you ever look at evolution, you're looking at geology, you're looking at chemistry, you're looking
I think
biology.
Is a really good example of where like we have an understanding of it nowadays, but actually it's come from this piece through history that has generally and gradually built up and up and up into what we now have as an understanding of evolution. But one of the brilliant things I think about science is the fact that it's not like evolutionary biologists are suddenly sat back thinking, we've done evolution now. Like actually people, they're still eager to explore more, find more evidence, add on to that sort of bulk of knowledge that they've got. And it's that ever expanding, ever improving, all of that's actually brilliant about science, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And like when you talk about evolution, one thing that I think is really cool to think about is there's so many different, when we think about the different processes, I think of like germ theory and like the way that we watch how germs evolve, and we can actually watch them evolve from one thing into something completely different. So you talk about the scientific process in terms of germ theory, and I think, or in terms of biology and in terms of evolution, and the first thing I think of is what it took to discover how to make things like vaccines or medicines, or the scientific process used to discover that penicillin is an antibiotic, right? Like what we take for granted is that those processes took years and years and years, many failures, right? And sometimes this stuff was discovered by accident. Like sometimes they were trying to find something else.
A good example of that.
Right. Yeah. And then we learn more and more about it, but the initial discovery or the initial scientific experiment, it was completely unintended. Yeah. So that, I think that's something really interesting about science in general that I think we sort of take for granted.
I watched a fantastic show on, I think it was on Netflix, and I don't remember the name of the show. I wish I could remember what it was called. And it was basically, there were several scientists from different fields on the program, on the documentary. And it started off with one, and it was explaining a little bit about one area, but it was actually talking to a scientist from another area and teaching him about that. And then the second scientist would go explain about his area to a third scientist from another area. And it went on in a chain, and it was absolutely brilliant because these guys didn't have science is so rigorous. It's literally like training to be a doctor, to become an expert in your field, and you don't have time to study these other areas. And this program just showed that they literally had no understanding. We kind of, as lay people, think scientists.
I know, if you're a scientist, you're now an expert on anything.
Everything.
And
that's not the case.
Yeah, it's the same as like I'm a linguist and I speak French and German, but just because I'm a linguist doesn't mean that I also understand Arabic and Chinese and Swahili.
Or computer languages.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you both think about this whole religion versus science thing as well? Because I think you do hear from religious people a lot about being anti-science or not.
Oh my, you're asking me this question.
Yeah, let's start with Gilliver, because
First of all, I don't think there is a science versus religion.
No.
There is science and there is religion, and they're not in conflict with each other. I think the people, secondly, and we've had this recently on a recent show I did where we were discussing, it was supposed to be 2 hours long, it went on for nearly 4 hours. We were talking about an atheist guy who converted to Islam and reviewing a conversation. And within that conversation, the guy who we were reviewing said religion is science is a subset of philosophy, as though that somehow demeaned it and made it less than philosophy. And it's sorry, go on.
Sorry, isn't that an argument tactic? It's a fallacy.
Yeah.
Where sure, it could be technically true.
It's not a fallacy, it's technically true. But
yeah, it's technically true, but the fallacy is in that it makes it sound weaker than it really is.
Yeah. And that's exactly how he was putting it across. He was putting it in across because he wanted to defend his religious idea. So he's trying to demote science by saying, well, it's only a subset of philosophy. Yes, it is, but it's the fucking best subset of philosophy.
It's sort of really right now the epitome of philosophy. Like philosophers come up with questions, science tests them.
There was a guy. There was a guy who's actually one of the new hosts of Talk Heathen, J Mike, who's far better at I am than philosophy. He's really, really good at philosophy. And as I was saying this at the same time in the chat, as we were streaming the program, he actually said Einstein came along and absolutely blew all the philosophers who were talking about the same things as he was out of the water.
Yeah.
And that's the power of science. It is a subset of philosophy, but it is without a doubt the best subset of philosophy for understanding the world that we live in.
I think as well, we've obviously done an episode on philosophy, and philosophy is great at asking those questions, but scientists can actually find some of the answers, which certainly does make it a much more powerful branch.
Philosophy is great for asking the questions. Science is great for finding the answers.
I think that's exactly what I was saying. That's absolutely right. Like, and I think that the same is true. So when you bring religion into it, this is where when I hear about the religion versus science, where this is exactly where I have the most to say in the conversation, because I really think that religion at its very earliest stages started out as early science. It was man seeking to understand and explain their reality with zero method to do so and zero context. And it's kind of like putting a toddler into a room, giving them a basic language, and then asking them to figure stuff out or explain what something does with no context, right? And so I really think religion started out as sort of like our first rudimentary scientific process.
Yeah, and we can't forget, and we've talked about it before on the show, we can't forget that that's not dismissing those endeavors. Because
I think
as time has gone on, that has built up. And as we've talked about before with Islam gave us some great scientific breakthroughs that later scientists during the Enlightenment built on. And it is valid, and they did great work. We're not trying to belittle that at all.
Because I think as well, it's almost like a parallel between science nowadays and those early religious sort of ways of explaining things, in terms of they're both kind of like versions of storytelling. Like you think about a scientific theory about like explaining how X happens in the universe, or how, what happens straight after the Big Bang, and understanding all the, I don't know anything about it, but like all the equations about how molecules matter, I don't even know. But like the theory is the story of how that all happened. And I guess, like those early religious texts are the story of what happened, just with the sort of ability to see and think that they had without understanding all the tiny little details about everything. And it's, just a different type of story.
So you remind me of, I can't remember his name, is Yuval, I think it's Harari, his book Sapiens. And it talks about exactly that. Like what sets us apart as a species is our ability to storytell and tell narratives. And now some of them are imaginary, like our money systems are imaginary. We all agree to it, but it's an imagined story that we all agree to, and then it becomes our reality. But then there's also stories that we tell that are more explanatory, more explanatory. My brain just went, and those are the stories that are like, I see this, I witnessed that, I test this. This is what happens consistently when I do that. And so you're right. It's our ability to articulate or put into words or a narrative. Hey, here's what happened, or here's what we see in terms of observations, right? So it's kind of interesting that you brought it up like that, because that's exactly what that book is about. Is about our propensity to do that, and how it allows us to become more complex and allows us to build more complex societies and come up with all this technology. Like if we didn't have the story to pass on from person to person for how to make each and every little part of this phone, we wouldn't have a phone.
Yeah.
I concur.
So science is a really complex story. I think science is more the way of breaking down what we see and find and witness so that we can build the story, maybe.
I think I like as well what. Sorry, go on, Gilva.
No, go on, you talk.
All right. I was just going to say about something that you'd said a few weeks ago as well, about how, just going back to the whole sort of religious idea as well, in terms of the conflict that people see between the two fields, in terms of like the disconnect that people have between the science that specifically disagrees with their ideas, like evolutionary biology, like astronomy, all those sorts of things, compared to sciences that do give them, you know, technological wonders like the internet, which can enable them to communicate their ideas about various things.
Irony noted.
But yeah, I think it's interesting how people do cherry pick the bits of science that they disagree with, the bits of science that they don't disagree with, just on the basis of, well, that doesn't, you know, match up with my preconceived ideas about how the universe works.
So that kind of brings up an interesting, actually there's two topics in my mind that it brings up. So I'll try and like introduce both of them and let you guys decide which one we want to talk about or when. One is when to accept and reject scientific teachings. And the other one is like what is good and bad science, right? So like there's scientific processes that seem legit, but when you break it down, it doesn't actually work. It's like pseudoscience or bad science. But then there's also the concept of I'm going to reject science based on my preconceived notion. I think those are two separate topics. And maybe we can cover them after we get back from a short commercial break.
So what have we got coming up? On the 26th of May, Laura is on The Perspective again. She's now a regular host on that show. Really looking forward to see her. She absolutely kills it every single time she's on.
I don't know that I kill it, but I do have a lot of fun when I'm on there.
It is a lot of fun. And the thing is with that show as well, not that, I mean, this is going to turn into an inadvertent advertisement for Ethan Michael, which is no bad thing. But
nope, shout out to Ethan.
Shout out to Ethan. The thing is, and I've hosted on there before, and I'm going to host on there in the future with you.
I think we have a date pick, but let's not announce it yet, just in case it's not solid.
The thing about that is you get such a variety calls. You literally do not know what's going to come along.
Much like our podcast.
But this time you're talking to people who are phoning you in, and you literally you don't even have a subject before you get the call as to what you're going to be talking about. It's fantastic. It keeps you on your toes. So that's the 26th of May. You're on there. That's next Tuesday. So really looking forward to that. On this coming Saturday, I am recording with now I'm going to crucify this name here because my Spanish is awful. Mateo Montero.
Sounds good.
And I believe you have been on his show before, Laura, as well.
A couple of times, yes. Yeah, he and I have been doing several collaborations, and we intend to do several more in the future. So
yeah,
I need to spin back up on my Spanish so that I can start dubbing my own voice, because right now
I've got a little story about that, which I'm going to come to in a minute. But not your Spanish, but mine.
Oh, yeah, okay.
He invited me on to talk about the Kalam cosmological argument, and
you have a lot to say about that.
Unfortunately, I've been doing it a long time. Yeah. and various logical fallacies. My Spanish is awful, and as some of our listeners and viewers may know, I used to be a wrestler, and as you're assigned characters in wrestling, and during my time wrestling, I had two characters, one of which was a Spaniard, and I can't do a Spanish accent. It was called Ricardo de Love.
Oh, de Love sounds very like French or Italian. It doesn't sound Spanish at all.
I know. I was just assigned the character. I didn't think of the character.
Maybe de amor.
I had to do. I literally tried to copy her, and so I just had Antonio Banderas in the mind every time I cut a promo, and they were just really, really bad quality. It was hilarious.
Oh, Lord.
That's my Spanish story. On Monday, I'm going to be recording on my own channel, and both of these shows are only being recorded on those days. I'm not sure when they're going to be broadcast. On Monday, I've got an interview, my second interview. My first one was with Jenna Belk. This one is with a guy called Blaine Tucker, who's an atheist. He's come out of religion, But what makes it slightly different to other deconversion interviews is he's also a cop.
Nice.
So we're going to be talking to him about that side of things and how it's been accepted in this community, which is sometimes very anti-cop, doing the job he does.
Oh, nice.
That's what I've got coming up. Richard, would you like to talk? Sorry, Laura, go on.
No, I was just gonna say we can move on from that. I just never thought of the atheist community as being specifically anti-cop. That's news to me. But moving on.
Richard, we have, I am led to believe, a little Facebook group that people can join.
We do, and we've had a little flurry of new members in there, which has been lovely. But yeah, certainly our official discussion group on Facebook is the place to be. And although things are reopening slowly in the UK as COVID restrictions are being lifted, so people do have reasons to leave the house. Despite that fact, people still have mobile phones on which they can access our discussion group so that they can still continue to ignore their friends when they're actually seeing them in person and continue to comment and talk about what we're talking about on here, but on the discussion group. As well, you can find a link to that and all the other platforms where you can find us on our Linktree/Skeptic Hangout.
And you could talk to us directly on that discussion group. If you want to talk to any of us individually, you can go straight on there and ask us a question, and every one of us is more than happy to answer.
Yes, and feel free to tag us if you want to hear individually from one specific one of us. Just tag us because we're monitoring that group all the time.
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome.
So back to the show.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Okay. So where were we at?
Okay.
You asked questions, didn't you, Laura? Yeah.
Yeah. So now that we're back from our little commercial break, we had left off with two different questions, and they're subtly different. One is discussing when people reject science based solely on whether or not the scientific model that they're being presented corresponds with their idea of reality or not. And then the other idea is like the whole pseudoscience thing. Like, how do you really know when science is good science or when it's crap? Take it away, Richards.
Right. Is it good or is it bad? That's a difficult one because I think you can have science that doesn't work, which isn't necessarily bad.
Okay, so let me give you an example then. Like the flat earth theorists and they're the science that they bring in to justify their belief. That I would call pseudoscience. I would call it bad science.
So I think is there a thing about, like we were saying before, about how scientists in one branch of science don't necessarily know details about other branches of science, and actually for us as lay people, it would, I think, possibly be quite difficult to even tell the difference between like science. And I think this is possibly why lots of people do fall for things like flat earth and those sorts of things, because there are things that sound impressive and scientific and complicated, or you look at something that's full of equations, whatever it is, but we don't necessarily know enough about it in those technical nitty-gritty details in order to know actually this is bullshit or if it's actually all right.
Yeah, and I think that's compounded by the fact that even within disciplines you can have and I've got two things in mind here. You can have competing theories, which are both sound. Yeah. They're using the same information, but they're coming up with different ideas and they're testing them all the time. But while they're being tested, I remember there was an idea of predicting volcanic eruptions, I think it was, and two major competing theories on that using the same data. And also this one's pretty much been resolved now, but thinking back, the end of the dinosaurs.
Oh, what caused the end of the dinosaurs? The extinction event. Yeah.
Yeah, because at one time there was this both of these hypotheses supported the asteroid impact as being the eventual cause, but there was some data to suggest that they may have been declining anyway before that happened. And so you've got, even sometimes within fields, you've got different hypotheses, different ideas. And from an outside perspective, it can make it look like some of that's bad and some of that's good. And it's not necessarily
the case. As well, even that idea of like, oh, well, they can't even agree, so obviously it's all nonsense as well. Like there's that too.
Oh, I like that subtle discussion. So not only are you talking about like pseudoscience or bad science, but you're also talking about the confusion that happens while science is being scienced, like while scientists are sciencing, right? So when you're in the process of discovery, there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of data being shared back and forth, a lot of discussions being had. And so what you guys are talking about is that sort of loss of trust that people have for the scientific process when they start to hear some of these competing theories, right? And like
even if it's legitimate, yeah.
Right. And even if neither scientist is saying like here is the absolute proven truth, they're both just exploring the fact that they seem to be at such odds. Well, and sometimes they actually are at odds. Can really cause a break in trust because the whole idea
is science is always improving and is never satisfied with having reached an actual definitive truth or an answer about anything.
Because that's not what it seeks to do.
Well, isn't
that's not its remit, but then people want that absolute answer as well, don't they? People gravitate towards, for lack of a science pun, gravitate towards that sort of absolute answer, but science never gives that, and so that's can seem like a weakness.
And it's a weakness that is exploited by going back to Laura's original question, the pseudoscientists who jump on that and say, well, you haven't got the answers, so look at this. I was watching, God, I've got so much to say on this. I didn't think I was going to have anything to
I love it. Keep it coming.
We'll go from slightly less ridiculous to more ridiculous as I answer this. So as most people know, I've had conversations for years with people who believe in God and things, and people, young Earth creationists and things like that. And I remember talking to was it the Young Earth Institute or someone like that, one of these big kind of organizations which has its own scientists. They send people off to learn real science to get qualified, and then they come back and kind of try and use it to legitimize young Earth creationism. And I was once in conversation with someone from one of these big, I can't remember which organization it was, one of those organizations, and they were putting out all this bullshit which people were buying. And as it was on a Facebook group, because these guys are based in the US and obviously I'm not, so it wasn't a personal conversation. It was on a Facebook group. I think I might have been a comment. I might have commented on one of the adverts they'd put out actually, and they'd put a load of bullshit out, and I just responded with, where are your scientific papers? Where, if your ideas are that good, why haven't you actually put your papers forward, put it to peer review?
Why isn't it standard?
And let the community who are experts in that field, let them judge whether it's a good idea or not. And I was literally blocked from the group, like pretty much as soon as I made that suggestion. But what a lot of these creationist organizations do is they set up their own institutions where they can practice their own branch of science. And a lot of them are against, and it's not just creationisms, it's like climate change deniers and stuff. And they set up their own little institutions, and they want to get rid of peer review. They literally campaign to get rid of peer review because they say it's bad. It's a bad, and people should be allowed to put their ideas out, and they should be legitimate ideas without contention.
Yeah, like the peer review thing as well. I've seen people claiming, things like, oh, well, the scientists who peer review these things have obviously got their agenda for this and their agenda for that, as if scientists are one like homogenous group who like think the same things about everything. And that's absolutely not how the world works.
So I actually had a conversation with someone very similar to that the other day, where they were saying something along the lines of like scientists have this, like they want to make science appear as much against the Bible as possible. In fact, I think it was on The Perspective. Don't quote me on that, but it was on one of the live shows I did. It was I think it was The Perspective, where the gentleman said like, well, the reason why these scientific facts are so mainstream and why they get through peer review is because scientists want to make geology and astronomy and all that appear to be as much against Bible history as possible. And that's my big question. First of all, a lot of scientists are Christian, right? Many. I would, especially because not all sciences even touch subjects that have anything to do with creation story or with evolution or anything like that, or cosmology. But the other thing with that was that it really makes it seem like, just like it makes it, people can kind of make it seem like all Christian churches are all together and they're all teaching the same thing and they're all like in this big vast conspiracy. It's like scientists have the same thing. They have this club that they show up at and they're like, all right, people, here's how we're going to explain it, right?
So the thing is, it comes to that closed belief system we talked about in the episode on conspiracy theories, doesn't it? Yep. It's this idea that scientists have got an agenda. You've got to have that in place if you believe these things, because if you don't, your whole argument crumbles down. So there's got to be an underlying conspiracy for what you believe to actually stand up. And then you get into these closed belief systems.
Yeah, but let's go back to like what we were talking about, where with the individual who said like earlier, oh my gosh, I just lost my train of thought, but where you were saying, like owning the truth when it is the truth, like science being a subset of philosophy. I'm like, yeah, let's own that. That's true, but let's describe it as it is. Yeah, there are scientists who have their own agendas, just like there's young Earth creationist scientists who have their own agenda.
Yeah, of course so, yeah.
There's the climate denier scientists who have their own agenda, or the ones who work for like essential oils companies, right? That kind of stuff. Claiming they do things that they don't actually do. So yes, I would say let's own that. There are scientists that have their own agendas, and some of those agendas could be scientists that say we want to support and stuff, and maybe their agenda is anti-Christian. Let's just go with that for a second. That's the point of peer review, and that's the point of science, and that's the point of replicating and double checking and having the conversations, and that's the point of disagreement in the scientific community.
Definitely.
Like, why are you
disagreeing? It's not a bad thing.
Right, absolutely. So let's call it what it is and let's own it. Let's not pretend that scientists are completely, opinion free and that they don't have their own ends that they want to reach. But
it's funny because on that point, I've had many conversations over the years with theists who kind of they try and defend their argument by saying, well, such and such a scientist thinks this, and it really doesn't matter what an individual scientist thinks. It's what they can show in the work, which is the important thing. A scientist is welcome to have any opinion they want. They can believe a pink fairy can poof up in front of them for any time in their life. For all I care, I'm not bothered what their own opinion is on something. It's what they can show in the work.
Yes.
What can be demonstrated that is the important thing.
What was their test? Go ahead.
I was going to say there's that whole thing about like consensus as well, isn't there, within a community? So I think like both of you have mentioned about like climate change as an area of science that is obviously moderately relevant at the moment. And one of the things that really frustrates me in sort of the media is that you often get like a yes person and a no person on TV when things like this are being talked about. So you'll be watching something on the BBC or ITV or any other brands of television that you wish to watch, and like they'll be talking about climate change, and so there'll be someone who says yes, of course climate change is a thing, and there'll be someone who's like no, it's not a thing. And so from that, people think that it's this 50-50 split, like it's a
that's frustrating,
and it's not like that at all within the actual body of people who study that as their profession. There is a consensus amongst people who are experts in that field that climate change is the thing, and there's things we need to do collectively as a species to combat that.
I mean, from my perspective with climate change specifically, and I've got to remember here, so I don't like strawman anyone, that I live on a small island which is temperate and prone to lots of different weather things. I don't live in like the middle of Nevada like Laura, where you get just like
Sun.
Where the system
a ridiculous place to live.
Say what?
Humans are not designed to live in places like that, Laura.
No, that's why we invented electricity and like water pumps. And
it's somehow difficult for people like me and Richard who come from where we are, where I'm 43 years old. I can remember when we had 4 seasons. I know we've said this before. If you live where we live and you're as old as I am and you're a climate change denier, there's something in my mind seriously wrong with you, because it's unfolded between, like, I've seen it. It's changed. It has changed massively.
Well, I don't know. So that is where the arguments start to get really, really complicated, though, because those same deniers will say, well, yeah, but there is natural flows to weather patterns over hundreds or thousands of years, or we do actually have these the ice ages melting. So the ages between ice ages are actually the shorter ages. And I can't remember what they're called, because I'm just not that kind of a geek right now. But we're in one of them, right, where we're not in an ice age. So they'll say, oh no, it's just the normal flow. What's that?
And like, we're just on the cusp of going into the next step, which is a natural process. And
right, and we're supposed to be heating right now anyway, and then we'll go into another cooling process. So a lot of times when we say, like, look, but it's obvious our weather is changing, they do kind of have an answer for that. I think
but then you find that people making those arguments happen to have relatives who are in the gas industry, or
you know, that's a whole
just
other argument.
Happenstance.
Yeah, but I think the point is, though, that like the data is really, really complex, and people don't understand it, and they don't necessarily want to, or are even necessarily able to take the time to really look at it and analyze it. And then those of us who are lay people who don't even know how to translate it correctly. So you get a lot of these. I've heard podcasts with guests on with some really crazy ideas about things like climate change and stuff. But when they're talking, they're like, yep, this is a hobby of mine. I've been researching it for years. I've read all the documents. And it's like, oh, okay, so your personal conclusion is this. And then it goes back to what Jilliver said. Where's your paper? Why aren't you publishing this stuff? Where's the peer review? Who's analyzing?
How do we as lay people... Sorry, Richard, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say that raises a really good point about science communication as like an art form. Because I think, and again, going back to the climate thing, like, I was reading a news report about the upcoming climate conference in Glasgow, and the fact that, like, as a sort of baseline, we need to stop global temperatures going 1.5 degrees higher by the end of the century. And I think watering it down to, like, this is a very clear and easy to understand goal that is agreed upon among scientists. Obviously, it's incredibly complex how that all works, all the factors in there, but like enabling people to have something like that they can understand quite easily is really important. And even things like changing terminology that's used in sort of mainstream media and by scientists, from things like global warming to then climate change to now often people talk about climate crisis. You know, that communication element of it, I think, is really important to help lay people understand, and the population as a whole to understand these ideas, because there is more to it than just global temperatures going up 1.5 degrees.
Right.
But like, we need to understand it in some sort of way and have some sort of context with which to understand it. And I think, that science communication strategy is a massive part of working towards that.
So bringing together what we've just been talking about and what Richard's just brought up about science communication, how, if we're talking to someone who is a denier of whether it be climate change or evolution or whatever, how do we avoid, as lay people who aren't science communicators necessarily and who aren't experts in the field at all, how do we avoid making an argument from authority?
I know that's kind of a tricky question, isn't it? Because, like, so if I was arguing with someone about a belief that I thought was like dead wrong, and I'm like, hey, where's your evidence? All they need to say to me is like, okay, how can you prove the distance between the Earth and the moon? And I'm like, I don't know. The scientists over there figured it out, and I believe them. Oh, why do you believe them and not me? Like, well, okay, that's a little trickier, right? So you're right. Like, there's sort of a level of, we should all be a little bit more skeptical, and we all should do a little bit more research, but we're all also just trying to get from cradle to grave. And we're all trying to to earn our dollar and to love our families, and like how much do we really care about the exact distance between the earth and the moon, right, versus whether or not the earth is flat or round or whatever. So I'm not even answering that question. I'm seconding it. Like it's really difficult to know what responsibility the layperson has in determining which claims are true and false, even if they're the general consensus. Like how many times in history has the general consensus been wrong?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard enough anyways for just an average Joe person, but when you've got people like all three of us and especially me and Laura, who are doing like calling shows and stuff and answering people's questions, and you're having to in a way defend these things. And you're relying on this. An argument from authority, by the way, there's two versions that I'm going to butcher this, aren't I? And
you're going to set yourself
up. Here we go. So an argument from authority, as I understand it, there's two versions of an argument from authority. There's argument from authority, there's argument from false authority. So if you're making an argument from authority, it's me citing, let's say, Richard Dawkins on evolution. So I'm saying that because Richard Dawkins says this, it is true. Now, if I'm basing it on his work, then it's not a fallacy because I'm citing its expertise.
But just to clarify for the audience, only if you're citing the experiments and the work and the data. If you say, Richard Dawkins said this because, and then you're able to supply. Just saying, well, he said it.
Evidence for that claim. If I say it's true because Richard Dawkins says it, it may be referring to his opinion, which is an argument from authority and could be wrong. It could be that's a logical fallacy. An argument from
he was really pissed off and tweeted at somebody that he really didn't mean what he said, or there's loads of reasons why.
And that's the second example I was just about to give, which is the argument from false authority. So if because Richard Dawkins has been involved in a bit of controversy recently by tweeting about trans issues and citing science that he doesn't know about. So if I was to quote Richard Dawkins on that, saying, well, Richard Dawkins says this about trans issues, that would be an argument from false authority, because although he's a scientist, he's not a scientist in that field of study.
Just because he's a biologist too. Like that has a lot of authority behind it. So people assume that all biologists know everything there is to know about sex and gender and stuff like that. And like biologists have their fields of study, just like every other type of science.
Yeah. So taking that into account, that it's very difficult for us to make those arguments and we must be mindful, especially as skeptics, not to fall into those fallacies while we're making those arguments, not to base those on that we've heard the opinion of a scientist, but we have a reasonable grasp of the work that they've done in that field.
Yeah.
Because I think it's easy for us to see the things that scientists say, and because we're skeptics and sort of look at the world in a sort of pro-science way, I guess, like I think it would be really easy for us as skeptics to fall into the trap of not thinking skeptically about certain aspects of science because it's science, as opposed to religious ideas or pseudoscience. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, and I think it is important that we as skeptics do still skeptically think about those things as well.
I think you bring up a really good point, and that was actually one of the things that I wanted to talk about. So it's a great segue into it. Is just because something is called science doesn't mean that you need to necessarily accept every single thing you hear about it just off the cuff without understanding it or without seeing the data. I remember having a conversation just recently about there was a test done. God, I wish I could remember the test. If I remember, I'll bring it back up. But a conclusion was drawn, and they did a whole news article on it. But when you looked at the actual data, you can't actually draw the conclusion from the data. They kind of did this little like, well, here's what we think about it. It was something about like the rise or fall of atheists in comparison to the rise and fall of Christians, right? And then you look at the data and you're like, well, okay, maybe not quite. So there's this whole idea of just because a test was done. Whatever conclusions are drawn, they must be the right conclusions. And I think a lot of it goes back to, like, if we're going to be skeptical, it's not bad to accept what you read or what someone says kind of off the cuff, but accept it maybe with a grain of rice, or accept it lightly. Maybe be willing to challenge it or willing to change your mind. Like, I don't think we have to reject every single thing every single time, but I think that there is something to be said about, like, oh, okay, that sounds good for now. That's interesting. Wow, I didn't know that. Right. But then don't hold on to it so tightly that you can't challenge it.
And that links to what you said as well before, in terms of like, some things just aren't a factor in our day-to-day lives, and we're just trying to get from one place to another, one job to the next. And actually, sometimes it's enough to just be like, okay, that's fine. But then later, when it matters more, investigate it more.
Yeah. So, like, an example, like, let's say a new form of transportation, like a new train or whatever, and it travels at a certain speed super fast. Like, I don't know what science or technology goes behind it. I don't know what math was done. I don't know what engineering was done, what tests were done in order to build all the different parts, or to figure out how to get it to go from point A to point B. Like, I don't know all those moving pieces, but I'll get on that train and I'll go from point A to point B, and I won't even think about it or worry about it. Right. So you're right. There is sort of like this, there's a point where you just sort of take it at face value. Right.
Yeah. Some things you have to take at face value. When the practical issues that affect your everyday life, you've really no choice but to it's the areas of experimental study which I think in general, when people talking about science, and especially disputing science, it's those things. And we have also this difficulty of, I get advertising. I get this Science Focus magazine every month, and it's all well and good having things like that, which are popular science, and there's the headline news and stuff. But a lot of people would read that and they'd say, right, science says this.
Right.
We have to be careful. What I tend to do is I look through, I get the names of the people. I mean, I'm a boring tit, so I don't expect everybody to do this. But when I'm reading those things, if there's a study that interests me, I get the names of the people who've conducted the study, and I actually go through my academic facility and I get those papers and I actually read the original papers. And I think those kinds of magazines, as much as I love them, are half of the problem with people's perception of science, because for the average Joe public, who's not a boring person, who's not going to go and read the scientific papers, they will take that as, well, science says this. And then they'll go to the work and they'll say, well, did you know that science says this? And
there's a further level of complication there too, because a lot of times the scientific articles in a magazine or in a newspaper or online, those are written by journalists, not scientists.
Yeah.
And even like they might be written by journalists based on like an undergraduate sort of dissertation on something, or and I think just because someone is in a field doesn't mean that they're even necessarily well respected within the field, or that they've got rigor and whatever else. Writing an article about something seems like it offers a level of legitimacy, doesn't it, that isn't necessarily warranted. It often is, but isn't necessarily warranted, and that can compound that as well.
And so that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Gil, about science communication. And then I think Jill was one that asked the question, like, what do we do about it? What I think is really, really interesting, and this kind of ties into like how to be skeptic about science and be skeptical about approaching science, but also how to be skeptical about pseudoscience and bad claims and bad arguments. The problem is, okay, so we have Google that's free, and anybody can put anything up and you can learn anything you want, right or wrong, at the click of a button. But scientific journals and papers and studies are behind a paywall at all these different institutions that publish them, and you have to pay or be a part of an institution in order to access them. And to me, it should really be backwards. Like the majority of the information that we should be giving to the wider public should be vetted. It should be challenged. It should be scrutinized. And then all the opinion pieces, those should be behind like, oh, hey, here's Facebook is a private thing, or here's this private club over here, here's this discussion group, and like let these small little groups of and I'm sure it creates little pockets of echo chambers. We do that anyway, that's unavoidable. But the vast majority of the gossipy type information, or that I'm going to put out whatever I want, should be within a closed environment. And then the stuff that's been scrutinized and looked at and everything, that should be open and wide and available to the general public. So I think we have our priorities.
Yeah, I
exactly
entirely
backwards.
agree. Yeah. And I've spoken to a few people who've had papers published, and I don't think there's one of them who hasn't said, we hate that system of the fact that people have to pay to access our papers, because the guys who are writing the papers very rarely are seeing money, or not a great deal of a percentage of money from the things that these closed institutions charged for accessing them things.
And plus then only a very tiny proportion of people ever even knows it's there to be read, let alone then actually read it.
Yeah. And then, so I want to just throw out, because like now we're talking about like, oh, this information isn't available. And as I'm saying that, I happen to know that some of it is. So I am going to throw out a little free advertising. We are not sponsored by them, but JSTOR right now, and I don't know if it's just because of COVID or if it's always, because I used to use it through my institution and I don't know how it works publicly, but right now, JSTOR, if you get a membership there, and that is a place where academic articles and journals and stuff are published, they allow up to 100 free articles a month. All you have to do is put your email in and sign up for an account, and you can access, as a layperson, 100 free articles a month, which is a shit ton if you're just a layperson just wanting to do some research. The problem is I don't know what conditions created that, because we were already into COVID when I graduated. So by the time I learned that, I don't know if it's like something that they're offering during COVID and it's going to go away or what, but look into that. That's like one thing that I wish every single person in the world knew about. But as I'm saying, hey, it's like kind of paywall, at least for now, 100 free articles aren't. So go take advantage of them while you can. But I just want to throw out there, sometimes there are ways of accessing that information. It's just not easy.
Yeah. I think on that note, I think talking about scientific papers when the discussion is about science is a perfect place to end the discussion on the highest kind of level you can for doing research. So
absolutely. Yeah, I think the conversation has come full circle, right? Like, I think we've kind of hit on all the topics I wanted to hit on. Was there anything else that either of you were thinking about or wanted to hit on before we wrap it up?
No, I had no thoughts about the show before we started, so I have no things to tick off a non-existent list.
The only thing I've got to say is I think as an advertisement for us, is I think we're doing an episode on research, if I remember rightly, at some point in the future. So if this has piqued your interest, make sure you come back and listen to that episode, because I'm sure we'll be doing a deep dive into the area of research and how to conduct it and things like that.
Things like getting on Google and finding the first article that agrees with what you have to say. No, no, I'm sure it'll be much more in depth than that. Yeah. So if that's all you have, gentlemen, I'll go ahead and close it out.
Real.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining us. I hope that anything that we have said has like piqued your interest, or that it's kind of generated some thought or discussion. Definitely one thing I wanted to say about this is it is good to be skeptical about all things, not just those things that you think you disagree about. So this is one of those episodes where, as skeptics, we get to take a look at a facet of our society that generally people think that skeptics just take for granted or just take at face value. So it's kind of cool to pick apart something like that. Yeah, so thank you all for joining us. We are Laura,
Richard,
and this has been Skeptic Hangout. Until next time,
keep questioning,
interrogate your beliefs,
and stay skeptical.
Bye.
See you later. Bye-bye.